Everyone, thank you so much for joining us for the launch of the Maturity Gap Report. I'm going to start with a quick run through of the agenda so you know what to expect today. We're going to do some quick intros and also a bit about what has happened to date, including talking about business maturity, what it is, what the eras are, what the quiz is, the headlines from this report, what the maturity gap is, some next steps. So my name's Harv. I'm an ex in-house operations director at a pan-European creative consultancy that was based here in the UK with entities in France and Switzerland. Hopefully, some of you know that I host the Handbook, the operations podcast, which I'll tell you a bit more about towards the end of today's session. And I'm head of brand comms at a platform called Scoro, who's our sponsor today, which I joined 2 years ago after having been a customer and a power user for a number of years and seeing the huge impact it had on our organization. And alongside me today, I've got Manish Kapur. Manish, if you wouldn't mind giving us a quick intro to the audience about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Harv. Hi, everyone. I'm Manish. I'm an ops consultant. I work with agencies and consultancies where they've got a very good problem to solve. They've got a lot of work and their internal operations are starting to crack due to the volume. So I'll go in there and have a look and see what's working and what's not and help them fix it.
Thank you very much. We also have Rich Brett, FinOps expert, with us. So, Rich, if you wouldn't mind telling us who you are and what FinOps means as well.
Oh, that's a good question. Hi, guys. Nice to meet you. I'm ex-agency. I've been in agency about 13 years. Worked for We Are Social for 6 years through a big period of growth. And now I'm FinOps consultant at agencies and professional service firms. But FinOps is that sort of gap where finance and ops align. So I tend to try and get finance operations to try and mold together so that operations tells me what finance is showing and finance guides operations. So it's a lot about trying to get those two things to talk together.
Excellent. Thank you both for joining us today. Huge fans of you guys, and I've learned a lot from both of you. So, really excited to get your input on the findings in just a moment. Okay. To set some context, everyone in the audience today are agencies and consultancies, right? Which means we are professional services businesses in agency land and, consultancies. We may not be familiar with calling ourselves that, but that's exactly what professional services means. It means you're in the business of selling time. And Scoro is a professional services automation platform. Okay. So it's designed for businesses like yours. And I promise to be quick with this before we dive in. If you haven't heard of Scoro before, it's a platform that brings together your quoting, your resourcing, your project management, your time tracking, your expense and purchase tracking, invoicing, and business reporting all into one place. You can link up your things like your HR platform, your accounting platforms, your large language models into it, and loads of other systems. So it becomes a single source of truth. And like I said, this is a platform I've used and loved, and that's why I vouch for it. Sometimes people refer to platforms like this as CRMs or ERPs or practice management platforms. The correct term is PSA. So just bear that in mind. So, on to today's topic, business maturity. What is it, right? So, we're very used to looking at our lives or even civilization in terms of stages or eras. But when it comes to our businesses, not so much. That's not a frame of reference often for most of us. But the thing is, we should, because the same principles apply. Our organization should mature over time. If we want to be successful, if we want to be profitable, if we want the growth, then we do need to operate as increasingly mature businesses should. And that's where the idea of a business maturity model comes in. Okay. So this is a business maturity model. They tend to have 5 stages. Depending on the model that you look up, the labels of the stages may differ. Okay. But the ideas tend to be fairly consistent. Now, the labels that I've seen online, they tend to be a bit clunky. So I've kind of invented some of my own over the past couple of years. I'm going to talk you through them really quickly. On one end of the scale, we have the chaotic era. Okay. So there's no consistency at all. Success really depends on individual heroics of people in the organization. And every project or every problem feels like you're starting from scratch. Okay. So that might resonate with some of you. Stage 2 is what I call the glimmers of growth. That's where you have pockets of best practice in the company, but it's super inconsistent. And usually those pockets of best practice come from individuals that are just a little bit more operationally minded or frustrated with the way things are running. We take it up a level and we get to the stable era. This is a fantastic milestone, right? Things are starting to look good. You've defined roles in your business. You've documented your best practice. Everyone's working the same way. You've probably brought in integrated tools by now. But while you're generating good data, you tend to look backwards at how you did last week, last month, and last year. Still a great place to be, but there's a ways to go. And then we take it up a level to the data driven era. This is where you're making decisions based on live data, right? You catch problems mid project. You can forecast what's coming in the business with confidence, and you operate consistently across teams. So, a really important stage that we should be aspiring to get to. And finally, the innovation era. So, at this stage, you're firing on all cylinders. You can really focus on developing and innovating your client offer and your customer experience to leave the competition behind, really. And there's continuous improvement built into everything you do. Okay. So, last summer, I launched the business maturity quiz, and really briefly, why. It was when I first moved into operations, my then boss, our COO, introduced me to the idea of a maturity model and asked me to look and assess where I thought our organization sat. Until then, I had been in a delivery role, and operations was something I was doing off the side of my desk. I was really proud of kind of a lot of the changes I brought into the organization, whether they were process or systems, ways of working, whatever it may be. But I didn't have the broader operational experience at the time to understand where our gaps were. I was basically fixing the things that were the biggest problem for me or that I heard the most complaints about. So the business maturity model I was asked to look at, it really helped me understand where the gaps were and understand that we had a lot of work left to do. That's why I wanted to launch the quiz, to create a really quick way for other people to have that same kind of revelation and understand where the gaps are in their maturity. It takes 3 minutes. It's 25 multiple choice questions, and it gives you a steer on how you rank across 5 operational pillars: people, process, tech, data, and growth strategies. Hopefully, a lot of you have already done this, and that's what this report that we're presenting today and launching today is based on. Before we get into the headlines, and I'm not going to make you wait much longer, it's worth looking at why this matters financially, right? SPI Research, which is a market research firm, they've been studying professional services firms for decades. There's over 50,000 firms in their data set, and the probability difference between the top and bottom performing firms is 7.7x. So it's not a small difference. But the number that you should hang on to is that for a $10 million firm, moving up just one stage on the maturity curve translates to roughly 270,000 in additional annual profit. That's the impact fixing your operational foundations can have. So, what did the 303 firms tell us? This survey was launched late last summer, and we had a cutoff date in early January where we took the firms that had completed until that point and crunched the numbers. So we've pulled out some of the headlines for this presentation. Some of them you're going to nod along to. Some should genuinely surprise you. And I do have to say that the full report goes into so much more than just these few headlines that we're focusing on today. So you'll want to read that after this presentation. But let's get into it. And I'll be asking Manish and Rich to comment on some of these as we go. All right. First of all, only 35% of firms have clearly defined roles. 59% describe them as somewhat defined and 6% as not defined at all. Okay. You might think this sounds like a small problem. We're just talking about kind of role clarity, but maybe it's just a bit messy. It's a poorly written job description, or there's no ownership over certain initiatives. But what the data shows is that role clarity is actually a huge maturity signal in its own right. 95% of chaotic era firms have a bottleneck with their decision making. Okay. So think about that. The majority of chaotic era firms have a single person signing off all of the decisions. By the time you hit the data driven era, that's stage 4 of 5, it's 37% still have that problem. So it's shrunk quite a lot. There's still a ways to go, though. So the firms that have figured out who's responsible for what are almost by definition the most mature ones. And the ones that are still fuzzy are on the bottom of that maturity ladder. I want to put it to Manish, actually. How does that line up with what you see on the ground?
Yeah, Harv, it doesn't really surprise me. I think one of the first things I ask for when I go in and do an audit or an agency is an organogram, because I want to get a feel for how it's structured. And before I've even started, I've kind of spotted a problem where there isn't roles that are clearly defined, and more importantly, there isn't clear line management either. And the first time someone will see a job description is probably when they join, but that's probably also the last time they see a job description. And as they move up the ranks, it does become a little bit clear and blurred as far as what the responsibilities are. And I do have to question is how can you assess if someone is doing their role right and performing it well if they don't really have clear guidelines about what they're actually accountable for? And I think, when people start off, it's all great, but as they start to move up the rungs, they take on more responsibility. That's when you get a lot of crossover. And it's not unusual when I go to agencies in particular to see kind of like pseudo titles of where someone might be an account director and then someone is a senior account director. And I'll ask, okay, well, what's the difference? Can you show me on paper so I can work out how those roles differ? And they go, well, actually, they don't much. It's just the title that we've given that individual because they wanted a promotion. And that's the best we could do to try and keep them in the business. And I thought, okay, I understand why you've done that, but you're opening yourself up to a hell of an HR headache. Because if someone else wants to be promoted to a senior account director, how do you say that they're not actually capable or right to move up? So I think having a structure really important, and you don't need to be of a large scale to get some kind of organization in place. Everybody needs to know what they're accountable for and who they're reporting to. And it doesn't matter if you're 5 person or 50. I think it's important to have some kind of structure in place.
Absolutely. And I've seen that, that problem crops up in annual reviews, in hiring, and all types of things if you don't have that clarity, right? So
Yeah.
you do need to sort that out at some point. And if you're kind of listening right now and recognizing that you have that problem, I'd say that's an exercise that you should probably prioritize sooner than later.
And also, I'll just say that leads into projects as well. The roles aren't defined about what people's role in the project is, then how can you be sure that the right people are responsible for how a project's run?
Absolutely.
Because if that falls in a gap and someone thinks someone else is doing it, then that's another reason why you lose margin in projects. So it's not just about the role, it's about the role within a project. Someone doesn't realize they're leading the project, then literally no one's leading it.
Exactly. Let's move on to the next. 21% of firms have documented their best practices. Only 21%, I should say. I mean, I find this shocking. I don't know about any of you. That means nearly 80% are running on knowledge that's locked in people's heads. Things passed down in like conversation, picked up by sitting next to someone or a Slack message. It's one resignation away from disappearing effectively, right? So as an example, one of the first things I did in my first ops role was build that central handbook for the organization, documenting our systems, our processes, and company information in a single place. And, I have to admit, when I was doing that, I had this fear that I was creating this resource for myself and no one else was going to look at it. Thankfully, that turned out to be very wrong. It ended up being an essential resource that everyone looked to. Also, because I used it to kind of signpost to whenever somebody came to me with a question, rather than having to answer the same question a dozen times a day, I could say, oh, go check the handbook. It's in that section, right? So what I find is that people feel more supported when there's that central resource. It gives them the confidence that the business has things under control and is organized. And especially when rolling out a new system or a process, it gives them somewhere to look when they need help as a first point of reference. And documentation plays a huge role in getting to the stable era, stage 3 of 5. You've got those repeatable processes and consistency across the business because everyone knows the way you're meant to be working. So again, Manish, you work with a lot of organizations on their kind of ops, of course, but I'm surprised by only 21% of firms saying they've documented their best practice. What do you see out there?
To be honest, I'm not that surprised. I think agencies work with a little bit of chaos. They see that as part and parcel of working in an agency, but it does cause a whole lot of problems. And I think the first one is particularly when new people join. So if there isn't anything documented and there isn't established ways of working, then the new person will bring in their version of it. Then before you know it, you've got 3 or 4 different ways of working to deliver the same kind of work. And that does cause a lot of pressure. Our environment is already pressured, let alone having ongoing confusion. I think people are normally quite surprised when I tell them that I'm not actually a massive fan of process. And they think that's a bit weird being an ops person. But I love best practice, and they're two different things. So you can map out your process from start to finish with all the ideal steps. And to actually get it embedded is tough. It's one of the biggest challenges that most agencies have. But what's more important is to identify what are the best practices. That's the certain steps that if you do not do, something will go wrong. So making sure that you have a properly scoped project, that you've all agreed what it's actually going to cost and the amount of time required on it, having a brief, internal reviews, wash up sessions. So whatever it might be is to identify what those best practices are. Because a process and setting a process, even if it's documented, is not a one and done. It's an ongoing, continuous review. So you've got the first version, you put it out there, you try it on an actual project and see how it goes. And then you review it and go, well, did we actually follow the process? Well, there's some steps missing. And more importantly, were we able to follow the best practices? And just picking up on what we said earlier is it's so important to have roles defined, because one thing I look at when I do look at processes is a RACI. It seems a little bit dated, but I still think it's really important, because knowing who is actually responsible and accountable in particular for that step is quite key. Because if it hasn't been followed, then you need to go back and talk to the right people to find out why it's not being followed. So having responsibility right the way through is really important.
And back to your point about onboarding, I think that's a really important one as well. It takes a lot of effort to onboard people if you're relying on word of mouth, first of all, as kind of requiring people's time, senior team members' time to literally take people through all the motions of how the business works. So having that documentation speeds up that onboarding process so much. So a really important way where just ends up paying dividends when you're going through a growth period, and people can be self-directed in terms of their kind of onboarding as well. Let's move on to the next point. Only 1 in 8 firms have automated any meaningful part of how they work. Only 1 in 8, and more than a third say they've automated almost nothing in 2026. Okay, so it's not that automation is new or complicated. It's just that firms have not made it a priority. Right? They're still doing manually what they could have automated years ago. But Manish, automation is something that we've been talking about for years. So why do you think so many businesses are still struggling with it?
Well, I would say at the moment, it's probably the biggest part of the work that I'm doing at the moment, particularly with agencies. I think there's a bit of confusion. First and foremost, I split AI and automation. In my view, they're two separate things. And automation is what I consider very much the low-hanging fruit. And I think ultimately what AI is going to do for most agencies is going to really hammer them down on cost. Because let's not forget, the clients of those agencies are also under pressure. They're also being told they're going to use AI to make themselves more efficient. And that will only filter down. And I think agencies will suffer because clients will say to them, are you using AI in your organization? And the reason they ask is, well, could you do the work cheaper? And that is going to be a challenging game going forward. But I think ultimately, when it comes to automation, it's about just taking away some of the tasks that you don't necessarily want the team to be doing. Because I think agencies in the long run have to be more strategic. If you're at the executional end, then that can be offshored or it could be done by AI. So if you want to survive, you have to be a more of a strategic agency where you can show the value and actually charge the appropriate fees. And automation is one way of doing that. And the great thing is there are tools like Scoro, for instance, that have automation built in. So the team can actually see how they can leverage automation in the real world by using practical examples. And I think the first point is just to remove some of the admin tasks, things that your team don't want to be doing, and get those automated, or certain tasks that you don't want to forget. Like for instance, like approvals. If you've got an approval flow for a quote or a scope of work, and that needs to go to multiple people, that should be set up as an automation. You don't want to be sending out one email and get feedback and then send out another email and get feedback. So that's just one small example. There's plenty. But I would say right here and right now, automation is a low hanging fruit and you just want to leverage it. And the great thing is a lot of the tools have this embedded. I think the reason why agencies aren't using it, I get a bit muddled about how much of AI do we need to be doing. My view is separate it out. AI is one thing, automation is something else. Start automating the tasks that you do day in, day out, are mundane, that your team don't necessarily want to do and don't add any value to clients.
If you haven't got clearly defined roles or best practice, how are you going to automate anything?
That's a good point. That is a good point. And I think just really quickly before we move on to the next is that it's such an important thing that, like, the AI becoming a bigger technology that we're more excited about does not replace automation.
Right.
AI is not meant to do all those automation things because it's still executing all those tasks one by one, where as automation just creates that flow for that activity. So it's important to keep that separate and look at it as kind of complementary technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just reading a little quick of the chat. Sean, you're right. I think ultimately, if your overall process is broken, you can't automate it. And one thing
Mhm.
I always recommend is that you actually map out your process from start to finish, review how you go about delivering work from start to finish, have your responsibilities aligned, get your race in there, and then look at where you can actually automate the tasks. What is you're doing to get from point A to B? And could that be automated? And it's all part and parcel of it. You don't want to automate a bad process because that's going to make things worse.
Exactly, exactly. And, one other thing that comes to mind is it doesn't unfortunately fill me with confidence about these businesses addressing and embracing AI in the best way if we haven't even looked at automating some of the things that we could be working on and taking some of these other maturity steps along the way that we're highlighting today. Let's move into the next point. When we start looking at the data side of things, there's also some kind of disappointing news. 0% of the lowest performing firms track time accurately. 0% of the lowest performing firms track time accurately. And before I get Rich to comment, there's kind of a similar point that I want to highlight on the next slide, which is 40. When we look at the full picture, 41% of firms track time and expenses accurately, but only 13% are using that data to make decisions. Okay. So the lowest performing firms aren't bothering to track at all. And here we have firms that are going through the effort of capturing that information, bugging their teams to do their timesheets, logging their expenses and all that kind of stuff, and then not acting on it. It just sits there. It's not connected to anything. It's not changing how projects are run or resources are allocated, which probably explains why there ends up being frustration with logging time in the first place. Like, it doesn't seem like you guys are using this for anything. So why should I do it? But Rich, I would love you to jump in and tell us what you think of this.
We probably don't. I spent years. I mean, we are social. I think the average age was 23 out of 120 people. So getting 22-year-olds to do their timesheets wasn't easy, but you've got to find ways to make it work. I think we tried to build in an understanding of commerciality and that we're using this data to help understand what you're doing rather than just making sure you're working. I think there's one thing I would say is that I think sometimes leaders can be a little bit weak on this in that you allow your team to not do timesheets. Well, part of their contract is to do timesheets. They kind of have to do them. But I think the big part is making sure that people understand what they're actually used for. And I think what you said is important. I think you've got to be transparent about what this data is telling us. It does not surprise me one bit on either of this. I think I'd probably suggest that 41% of firms that track time and expenses accurately, that's probably not right either. They probably think they do. I see very few who are using this data in a good way. And that's not just at the small sizes, it's talking up to very high levels because the data's not right. What's the point in looking at it? In the first point. The second part is, are the right people even looking at this? Project managers are really stretched trying to deliver projects. Are they going to spend time looking at this? You've got to make it accessible. You've got to make sure it's really clearly defined what this means. And then you've got to report it back. If you're not doing those things, you're not really learning anything from the stuff to do. I was chatting to an agency only yesterday who's trying to productize and do value-based pricing. And we both agreed that he needs to do timesheets. Now, most people would say you don't need to do that if you're doing value-based pricing because you're selling value, but you still need to understand how much time was spent delivering that value. So even if you're not selling on a time basis or selling on a roles and rate card basis, time is still the most effective way of understanding, are you making profit and how long did it actually take to deliver this work? It's not that difficult to set up. I've had a lot of complaints to me. I used to have the keys to the beer fridge. So on a Friday, if timesheets weren't done, then the beer fridge didn't get opened. That was a powerful tool, but ultimately it didn't work. Like what actually worked was just really talking to the teams and getting heads of department to understand
Yeah.
what their team was doing. And
Mhm.
we would every month take through that data and say, look, this is what your team's doing. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
And that's where we really started to see value because then heads of department, before they could hire anyone, could have to look at the data and say, oh, so I can see that my team aren't that busy. So therefore it's going to be really hard for me to justify a hire.
Mhm.
Suddenly it becomes, well, you show me that data and we can sign that off. So I think a lot of it is not down to people doing timesheets. It's actually the people who are more senior really embedding that culture of this is really useful data. It really helps
Mm.
us understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And we can then start using that for future facing capacity and resourcing as well.
Absolutely. And helping people, like you said, understand that it's not about tracking them, it's tracking like what's happening in the business with regards to projects. And, if they're saying they need additional resource, well, we need to see evidence of that in the amount of time that's being logged and what it's being logged on. And you're also right that if there's inconsistency and inaccuracy and people are doing it, it becomes almost pointless, because if there's giant holes in your data because three people just never log their time, it's not helpful, right? So you need to get everybody on board. There's a related point on the next slide. Again, it's actually somewhat an extension of this, that only 13% of firms use live data to adjust mid-project. So again, I think this is really disappointing. 41% are saying that they're tracking the time accurately, right? But of that, only 13% are using that data to steer what's happening on the project. So again, it's like, well, what is the point of even doing that, right? So was it just for fun? So the rest of the firms are basically waiting for the project to finish to send that final invoice and figure out what happened afterwards, if they even can get that picture together. But by then, there's nothing you can do other than just kind of take the hit, right? So this is the one I think has the most direct impact on profitability, and there's always evidence when you're tracking things on what could be going wrong. You see the budget drifting, you see your team burning more hours than expected, there's scope creep, all that kind of stuff. But if you're only looking at numbers at the end, you've lost the opportunity to course correct. Rich, anything to add here?
I mean, it's crazy, to be honest. I often say, let's start with the source of truth, which is how many hours have we sold? How much have we sold? What have we sold? We can most agencies and professional service firms have that.
Yeah.
But if you then just go blind into doing this work and just use timesheets to tell you how you're doing, firstly, that's a problem anyway, because timesheets are historic, and looking at something that's just happened isn't going to help you decide what needs to happen next week. So the basis has to be timesheets to say, well, how far through it are we? But really, it's the whole piece of, you've got to look at how you're doing, not just on time, how are we doing time against task and actually against delivery? Because then you can then go, well, actually, we've got 25 hours left we need to deliver with. How are we going to use those best? And this isn't going to solve profitability by doing this, but at least it allows you to have a chance to solve it. Because if you've misscoped something, changing halfway through isn't going to stop the fact that you've misscoped, but at least it gives you an opportunity to know that that's coming and to try and do something about it. Unfortunately, it doesn't surprise me at all. Because if the data's not right, if roles aren't defined, if best practice isn't defined, then why is anyone going to do this stuff? And who does it sit with?
Yeah.
A lot of people think that profitability sits with finance. Finance aren't delivering the project. Finance aren't booking in the resource. It has to sit with ops. This becomes a FinOps exercise, is that you've got to make sure those two things are aligned, that you're aware of revenue, profit, and time.
Yep.
I really like to, I think time is a really important factor, because if you sell 20 blocks of time, everyone knows you've got 20 blocks of time. If you start talking about profit margin or gross profit, that's a much more confused thing to talk about. Time and hours, most people should understand how time works.
Exactly. Manish, anything to add to that before?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I'm surprised that it is much as 70%. I don't know many that are tracking in real time. Look, in a creative business in particular, things don't always take the amount of time that you anticipated, and sometimes they take longer. Obviously we're about the quality, we want to make sure we're delivering to the client's brief. But if you're able to track the data, then you know where you might be able to recoup it. And as we said, is that, you may not say it completely, but you can try and do something to try and prevent the time of running even further. And agencies on the whole rely until the project's finished to go, well, how do we do? But by then it's too little too late. You've already overspent, you over-delivered. And probably worse, you kind of set an expectation to the client that you would deliver this type of quality on a lot less budget. So if you're able to track it in real time and the clients ask for more work or whatever it might be, at least you're in a position to go, well, actually, if we do this additional work, it's going to be X amount. You might be in a position where you can go back to the client and ask for more, but just tracking it. So, if you've gone over on one particular phase, you might be able to recoup on the next. But if you haven't got the data to tell you how you're actually spending the budget, then you can't do anything until the job's actually finished. And then you kind of just have to accept that project's gone way over. You just have to accept it as a loss.
And if you've got data that backs that feeling, that's what I want to have. Data tells you something, but what I'm always looking for is the narrative. And does this fit with what we're seeing? Does this fit with how we're feeling about this project? And if it doesn't, there's something wrong with the data. But you really want to try and get people to tell you what they think about it, not just use the data.
So we need to move into the next point, but I just want to highlight something that Rich said at the beginning of this topic, was also responsibilities. And having understanding whose responsibility it is, right? If there's no project ownership with the project managers and they don't understand that it's their responsibility to deliver this project on budget, then no one's going to bother looking at it, and it's just an exercise to collect timesheets. So again, really important point. Let's move on. Only 1 in 4 firms can forecast margins, revenue, and capacity with confidence. Keyword forecast, looking forward, being data driven. After everything we've just talked about, poor time tracking, data that isn't used, no mid project control, all that kind of stuff, this one absolutely does not surprise me. It's a result of all those gaps. You can't forecast confidently without kind of accurate inputs and good systems and good processes and roles and responsibilities defined. And a lot of firms don't have that kind of stuff in place. So, Rich, there's a lot of talk about being data driven, but this really points to the fact that the majority of us are not.
You should probably put a think they can as well here, because I've spoken to professional service firms who think they're forecasting, but actually they're not. They're just changing their budget and updating things and updating their pipeline. For me, a forecast shows me on the 15th of April where I think I'm going to finish revenue, staff cost, overhead, and profit. And it shows where the maximum of that is and where the bottom of that is. And I've spoken to agencies of various sizes up to 10 million and plus. And even those bigger firms aren't doing this because sometimes they don't have the systems in place to do it, because it takes that real collaboration between finance and operations. And sometimes I think a forecast is a finance problem. For me, a forecast is an agency problem. It's got to be solved by everybody. It's based on, to the marketing team, how much money the marketing team's spending, what's resourcing. And if you're not doing timesheets properly, you're absolutely not booking resources and capacity. And I think this is the one big thing that I try to get into all my firms is to forecast. We start with current month, and then as we get better, we try to move to next month, and then we try to get to 3 months. Obviously, the market is incredibly tough at the moment, but that doesn't mean it doesn't make forecasting easier. It makes it way more important because you need to make decisions quicker based on the volatility of the market. And I try to keep things quite simple. The thing to do is just, so your timesheets are done correctly, everyone's doing them, then start to go, right, we now know how to do that. Now let's look forward and then speak to your finance team about how you can get a forecast out. But again, this comes down to the fact that if you don't have good business practices and the right people in place, you're asking an owner to create a finance forecast, P&L forecast. That's not an easy thing to do if you haven't got the supporting cast around you to do it, or the system.
Exactly. Let's move on to the next point. Somewhat related. Only 1 in 5 firms run their operations in a single joined up system. So that it means 80% are bridging their projects and their time and their finance in disconnected tools and spreadsheets and kind of calling it a system, right? This goes back to the automation point. When your systems don't connect seamlessly, you can't have automation. And I think the important thing here is that nobody decides to build a disconnected tech stack. It's just how you kind of grow up in the organization. Somebody chooses off the shelf tools during those less mature times, and it just doesn't evolve. And then you continue to bring in more and more things, and they don't speak to each other, and no one takes the onus to kind of get those connected, or decide that it's time to level up to something that's more consolidated. So it's the problem here is that once you get in that scenario and you've gotten to this certain headcount size, it becomes more and more inefficient for your team members to be doing that. And you're probably paying higher salaries for people to be doing all this admin work to copy and paste information, cross check things, import and export. And you end up getting very lagging data as well. So you don't get a picture of what's happening today. You might, by the time you reconcile all those reports, even if they end up being accurate, which is unlikely, it might be a week or a month later. So, in my view and in my experience, this is an important milestone that most firms, agencies, and consultancies have to go through at a certain point in their growth journey to get to that higher stage of maturity. The spreadsheet and the 2 dozen systems thing only goes so far, and it becomes a liability. So we're running short on time, guys. I'm going to click through to the next one so we can stick on time. And this one is the one I wanted to end the headlines on before we get into some of the other stuff we're going to be talking about. And I find it a bit sad, actually. Only 13% of firms believe their operating model is ready to scale. So what I find interesting is even among like the top performers, the data driven and the innovation era firms, only 38% say they feel ready. So I think that probably points to that just being so much change and so much change needed to keep up with what's happening in the market that everyone feels unsettled and not quite ready. But the point is there's a lot of work to do to make sure that we're genuinely future proofing our organizations. And it's important to take the maturity journey and address some of the challenges we've been talking about across those pillars of people, process, tech, data, and growth strategies so that we're ready to address the bigger challenges on the horizon. Guys, any thoughts on this before we move on? But let's try to keep it a little brief because we've got to get to the Q&A and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I think 100% right there, Harv. I think ultimately the challenge is that you can only go so far. And obviously there's a lot of emphasis on sales, and that's how they see growth. I read one line, which I thought was quite telling, which was that efficiency is the new growth lever. And I think ultimately we're going to have to do more with less. And I think looking at how you're actually operating and the tools that you're using and how you're using your people and aligning responsibilities, all the things that we've already talked about are really, really important because, we can't help it. We are going to have a situation where the AI in particular is going to drive down prices. So it's going to be difficult for agencies to retain their margins. And the normal instinct is when you start to grow is to add more people, which obviously adds more overhead. And my belief is we'll just take a step back and just see what you currently got and ensure that you're using the right tech to leverage the people that you've got and ensuring that they're actually doing their jobs correctly and in the way that actually adds value to clients. And I think it's a constant review. It's not something that you put in place once and then you leave it and then you get to a point where you're in the shit and you go, okay, we now need to have a look at it. As you grow, as you add people, as you add clients, as you add revenue, you've got to be looking at your internal operations at all times.
Thanks very much for that. Let's keep moving as we've got a bit more content to cover. So, those were the headlines, right? But I want to really briefly show you what the distance actually looks like between the top and bottom performing firms. And that's really what the maturity gap report was looking at. So, this is the top versus bottom performers across all five pillars. And in fact, the way we've defined top performers are the ones that are in those top two stages of maturity, and bottom performers are in those bottom two stages of maturity. Okay. So you can see the gap between each of those pillars. A few things stood out to me. People has one of the closest gaps, around 40 points, which makes sense. That's something people tend to prioritize in terms of hiring and making sure they've got the right people in their teams. The real points of difference here are the data and technology pillars, where the gaps are over 50 points each, right? So that, of course, points to the fact that there's a lot of work we need to do on both of those to level up. And it's worth noting that even top performers are not scoring 100% anywhere, right? So there's room for improvement at every level. The gap is wide, but it is closable. And we need to be working on moving up that maturity ladder. So what's next? We're going to get to the Q&A in just a moment where you can ask questions and all that kind of stuff. But first, I wanted to quickly highlight three things you can do after this to start your business on the journey of leveling up. Step one, if you haven't already, take the quiz. It's the same 25 questions. You'll get your score across those five pillars, your overall maturity stage, and a steer on what to focus on next. And you can benchmark yourself against everything that's been covered today in the report as well. Step two is read the full report. Okay. The session here has covered a handful of headlines. The report covers everything else. It looks at every operational pillar and highlights where the majority land, as well as the gap between the top and bottom performing businesses on those answers. It looks at how much of a difference there is between industry type or business size. The report features stories from firms that have been on this journey, including their challenges in their own words. So you'll recognize some names, hopefully, in the report as well, of people that have contributed to it. And of course, some immediate actions you can take to get ahead of the pack. Okay, so that's step two. And step three, subscribe to the handbook, the operations podcast, which I host. We've got an upcoming mini series on the maturity gap, which is going to feature some of the content and resources that we're producing to help you level up. So that's going to be looking at kind of even tactical levels across each of those maturity pillars or operational pillars on things you can do to level up your organization. And of course, I interview brilliant people, in-house ops folks, as well as industry experts. So there's loads of stories on the podcast through interviews as well of people sharing their challenges and success stories and recommendations. Okay. If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to ask.
Yeah, I think whilst everyone's thinking of their questions, just jumping into the chat, there was a point from Jennifer. And Jennifer, if I don't do this justice, feel free to mute and correct me. But it's basically around, and the question is sort of please juxtapose best practices versus process for review. Maybe a little bit more around that.
Manish, you were talking about this. Do you want to take?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very difficult to embed any kind of process. When I've kind of done a process mapping workshop exercise, we mapped out the process. I would say there were only 30% of the players then. The hard battles now is to get that embedded. And when you look at your process from start to finish, you'll probably find that there's countless steps. A lot of it you'll do on autopilot, but it's only when you actually map it out, you realize that you've got a load of steps. Trying to implement that step by step is near impossible. And you'll go crazy trying to do it. So what's better is to go, okay, we need to have an element of flexibility. We need to be agile. So to try and get every one of these steps followed every single time is not going to happen. However, what we need to identify is there are some steps which are non-negotiable. That if you miss that particular step, something will go wrong. So we've mapped out this process. It might end up having 50, it might end up having 100 steps. But what we've identified is 10, 15, 25 key steps that have to be done. It could be that we ensure that we get the scope approved internally. Everyone agrees with what the budget is going to be. It's about making sure we get the brief signed off, the client signed off the brief, so we don't have to redo the work. That we have an internal review to make sure we're happy with it before it goes to the client. So you're identifying what I consider the best practices, which is the steps that you need to do to ensure that you're able to deliver the best work on time and to budget. And that's how I differentiate between a standard process and also identify the best practices. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Manish. That's great. We've got another one here. This is also a fab question. What would you say the top indicators are that an operating model is truly ready to scale?
From my perspective, I think, it's that you've got a forecast that is looking as far ahead as possible, because that proves the operating model can work and that you've got a system in place to understand that that's coming. But really, the only real indicator that an operating model is working and that scaling is that you're actually doing it, because you can't really know until you actually do it. But I think having that data that is telling you that, and that when you look at that P&L versus your operations data, those two things make sense together. I think that's the bit that really shows that it works, because if one thing shows that everyone's busy, but your P&L shows that you're not making any money, then obviously there's a disconnect there. And that means that you're not probably ready to scale. So I think it's about getting that data right, but using that data to then drive your forward-facing view on what you need to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I think, anyway, when things aren't, because there's a lot of internal pressure. We've got enough pressure coming from clients, but then internally, when there's a bit of friction internally, that something's not right. And the worst possible scenario is that you act upon it when people start to leave, and you never want to be there. You want to pick up on what's going on and say, well, actually, is this an internal issue and we need to deal with it? And it could be across all the pillars that you've already highlighted there, Harv, but you do need to address it. And I think it's too often, it's like a one and done. People look at it and leave it and then focus on the growth, but then start to keep reviewing it to make sure that it is fit for purpose. And the other thing is that your ways of working can change depending on the type of clients you're working with. Project versus retainers are very different, for example. So you always have to have it under constant review. And don't just see it as something as a given, because then you'll be one step ahead. And the forecast is so critical, because that will tell you when you need to start taking action. It's so important that when people say to me, resource management, what's the number one tool? I say, well, actually, the forecast is your number one tool. This one allows you to actually plan the resource well in advance and be able to handle it comes your way if you need to bring in freelancers or whatever. And I think the forecast is absolutely critical, because that will allow you to solve a lot of problems before they become serious problems.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you my instinct. When I first hear that question, I think of technology and AI and things like that, like what's next. But I think the important thing, like both of you have pointed out, is getting the foundations right is actually the most important, way to allow yourself to be set up to scale. So really important points.
I'm
Are
going
there
to
oth-
jump in with just one more to finish us off, if that's okay. And it's around addressing the possible conflict between role clarity and doing more with less. Does everybody just pitch in ever work?
Mm. You know what? I think that's a kind of a chaotic era kind of frame of reference where everyone just has to wear every single hat. And we've all been in organizations that are run like that, and it's not very effective. You can't do your job well as an account manager if you're also having to go, buy milk and, be meeting with the IT company and stuff like that. So if everyone's part-time HR, part-time operations, part-time finance, part-time office manager, it becomes inefficient. So I think getting more with less really means like productivity in my point of view within that role. So, the things that a project manager needs to do, can you do more of that efficiently with the use of tech and automation and AI and all that kind of stuff? What it doesn't mean is those people should be responsible for disciplines that are outside of their main area of focus. That's where the blurry job descriptions come in. No one's responsible for anything, and everyone's responsible for everything. It doesn't work, and it's a low maturity mindset in my point of view. Guys, do you agree or disagree?
100%. Yeah, I think ultimately it's about productivity. It's not about saying we're going to get paid one person to wear multiple hats and do loads of different roles. It's about allowing them to be more effective in the role that they've actually got. So they could take on more project work if they're able to do the stuff that they do best and take away some of the manual elements or so that's why I see it for doing more than less. It's not about trying to get people doing multiple different tasks because they're not always going to be skilled to do it and something will go wrong. Use the tech that's available to you to allow you to do the bits that you're really good at and get rid of some of the tasks that you don't enjoy doing. That could be automated, an example.
I actually think it can work, but it will stop work. And I think that's the point. I definitely worked at an agency where everyone did just pitch in, and it actually drove everyone forward because it became quite a competitive arena where actually everyone was challenging each other. But even that got to a stage where it's like, yeah, but this doesn't work because if that person then leaves or people leave, you can't do it. And I think coming back to the question about being ready to scale, I think everybody just pitch in and scaling won't work because it just doesn't allow you to have the right progress through, responsibilities and processes. It can, but at some point it won't. I guess that's my view.
A certain size and maturity level, maybe, and we all have to do that. But I think there comes a point where you end up starting to burn people out and they can't do their best work because they're doing everything. Frankie, is there any other questions or
No, that's perfect. Well, this brings us nicely to a close on time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Harv, and thank you, Scoro, for sponsoring. Also, Manish and Rich for your expertise. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. Hope you found today useful. Big thanks to Harv, Manish, and Rich, and see you all again soon.
thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
See you later.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
Bye.